When we disagree with someone, we often think the problem is simple. They're not being rational, they're biased, emotional, or just not thinking straight. That idea is everywhere, in politics, in debates about science, and in everyday arguments with friends or family. But my guest today asks us to pause before jumping to that conclusion. He studies how human reasoning actually works, and why it so often looks like we are reasoning badly. And that turns out to matter a great deal when it comes to trust. Because if reasoning works differently than we assume, then disagreement isn't just about logic or evidence, it's also about who we see as credible, who we listen to, and when we decide someone is no longer worth trusting. My guest is Hugo Mercier, a cognitive scientist at the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique in Paris and the co-author of the Enigma of Reason. Hugo, thank you for being my guest today and welcome to TrustTalk. Hugo, many people think humans are simply bad at reasoning, that we are biased, emotional and easily misled. Your work starts from a very different idea. What do you think most people get wrong about how human reasoning actually works?
Thank you for the question and thank you for the invitation. I think there are a number of kind of widespread notions about how humans reason and how they evaluate information that are indeed mistaken. One is that we often think that others are gullible. Like, we don't think that we are gullible, but we tend to think that others are gullible, that they fall for advertising, for political propaganda, for religious proselytizing. And I think a lot of evidence from various fields shows that people are actually quite hard to persuade, especially en masse. Like when you try to convince a lot of people at once, then again through advertising, through political communication, etc., it's really hard to do, and the effects tend to be very small and muted. So that's one thing that a lot of people and a lot of scholars to some extent as well will tend to get wrong. And the other one is about how we reason more specifically. So we're equipped with a lot of cognitive mechanisms that allow us to evaluate communication. So you can evaluate how trustworthy someone is, you can evaluate how competent they are. And reasoning is one of these mechanisms, and it's one that bears specifically on the quality of the arguments. So when the two of us talk to each other, if we don't agree, and if I'm not going to just take your word for it, then the both of us can use reasoning. You can use reasoning to give me arguments, and I can use reasoning to evaluate the arguments, and then I'm going to use reasoning to give you arguments in turn. And there, I think the mistake that people often make, and then again many scholars as well, is to think that reasoning would be primarily geared towards individual cognition. When you're on your own, you're faced with a difficult decision. You have to decide who to vote for. You have to decide what car to buy, what career to pursue. And people have this idea that if they reason really carefully on their own, if they try to weigh the pros and cons and so on, they will come at better decisions and make better judgments. In fact, the evidence suggests that by reasoning on your own, you're quite likely to just double down on whatever intuition or emotion you started with. And if you think, well, maybe this candidate is a bit better than the others in an election, and if you start reasoning about whom to vote for, you're more likely to find a lot of arguments for why you should vote for that person, as if you were anticipating having to justify or to convince someone of that decision. Here's a theory that Dan Sparber, my former PhD advisor, and myself elaborated. We think that reasoning has a social function. It evolved, its function is to argue and to justify our views with others. And so it works best when we are exchanging arguments with someone who doesn't agree with us, rather than reasoning on our own.
Is it too simple to say that we are just irrational?
Yes, usually it's a very poor description of people's behavior or thoughts. So people can be wrong, people sometimes make mistakes. But usually saying that they are irrational, it's just a way of saying that we disagree with them or that we want to kind of cast aspersions on what they're doing. And it's very rarely a helpful way of understanding why they're doing what they're doing. And so usually it's better to start from the principle that most people are by and large rational, And if they are doing something that you think is silly, it might be that you're misunderstanding their goals or their incentives. Someone might say something that you think is false, but maybe from their point of view, it might make sense because in their social environment, saying this is going to make them look better. They might keep their friends, keep their family, improve their reputation by saying something that you think is false. And so from that point of view, it can be quite rational sometimes to say things that are false, for instance.
You touched just on something that seems like core in your ideas, is that reasoning is mainly social, like you just mentioned, something we do with and for other people. In everyday life, what does that actually look like? For example, how do people reason differently when they are talking to friends or to strangers?
I think reasoning itself can be the same whether we're talking to friends or to strangers, in the sense that if a stranger gives us a good argument, we will still recognize that argument as good. Let's say you're a mathematician and you read a mathematical proof from a mathematician you'd never heard about. Well, what matters is not who the proof is from. What matters is the quality of the proof itself. But in everyday life, where things get a bit more complicated, is that most of the arguments we exchange rely partly on trust as well. So if I tell you, you should buy that car because I've read in that magazine that it is very safe. Well, the argument that you should buy that car because it's very safe is a good argument, assuming you value safety in the car. But you also have to trust me that I've actually read that in a magazine. You have to trust the magazine that the information is reliable. And so if you're talking to a friend, as a rule, you'll be more likely to trust what they're telling you rather than talking to a stranger. So even if reasoning is going to evaluate the quality of the argument in the same way, the fact that you're more or less likely to accept the premises as a function of who you're talking to is going to make a difference.
Does that mean that we usually decide who we trust first and only then start reasoning? Do we judge the same argument very differently depending on whether it comes from someone we already trust or someone we distrust?
That's a good question. Then again, it's important to distinguish the logic of the argument itself versus whether you accept the premises of the arguments. So let's take the case of people who are arguing about vaccination. Someone might say, well, I think we should vaccinate your child because vaccines are safe and it has been shown by a lot of studies. So the argument, you should vaccinate your child because vaccines are safe, among other arguments, it's a good argument, and everybody, even an anti-vax person, recognizes the logic of that argument. And if you tell them you should do this because it's safe, they will understand that logic. The difference between someone who is kind of pro and anti-vax is that one of them doesn't trust the source. They don't trust the scientific studies. They don't trust the scientific or medical authorities that says that vaccines are safe. And indeed, we have shown through experiments that when it comes to purely logical arguments that don't require trust at all, it's just a matter of the internal logic of the argument, people are just as likely to accept arguments that come from people they don't trust at all, from people who they think are really bad at doing something. The only thing they evaluate is the internal quality of the argument. And a very kind of striking example of that in real life is at the beginning of the 20th century, some of the kind of greatest minds in the West, people like Bertrand Russell or David Hilbert or Whitehead, were engaged in a project of trying to build logical foundations for mathematics. And it was all consuming for them. Like, they had devoted their lives to this. Russell and Whitehead had kind of famously written thousands of pages in the Principia Mathematica to try to do this. And these were really intense people, and they were extremely smart, but completely devoted to that task. And then at some point, Carl Gödel comes along with the incompleteness theorem that shows that it's not possible. You can't do it. And all of these people, they're all, very clever. They know the math and logic really well. They read the proof, they understand it immediately, and they drop it. Like this thing that had consumed their whole lives. They just drop it, even though the argument comes from a nobody who no one, had heard about, and they had no reason to trust him. But they understood the logic of the argument, and it was enough for them to change their minds and abandon this thing that was so important to them.
Another term in reasoning is confirmation bias. It's usually seen as a flaw. People only believe what fits their views. But in your work, it sometimes sounds like something that can actually help groups function. Can you give a simple example of when confirmation bias helps people reasoning together?
It's important when you talk about the confirmation bias to differentiate different things. So one is just sticking to our guns. So if you tell me something and I disagree with it, I might reject what you're saying. And I wouldn't call that confirmation bias in the sense that it's not confirming what I'm thinking. Like, it's not making me think something even more. Like, if I think A and you think B, you telling me B isn't going to make me think that I'm even more right in thinking A. And indeed, it's quite rational. If you were to tell me that my name is something else than Hugo Mercier, I wouldn't believe you, and that wouldn't be a confirmation bias or a bias of any sort. That would just be me sticking to my beliefs when I know that they're right. So it's not, so refusing what people tell us or putting less weight on what people tell us compared to what we already believe is not irrational as a rule. Indeed, it would be oftentimes irrational to not do this. In a more restricted sense and more, I think, useful sense, the confirmation bias, which we can also call the my side bias, is this tendency that when we reason on our own, or when we reason actually in general, we're going to find arguments overwhelmingly for whatever it is that we think is correct. So it's clearly true in a discussion. Like, if the two of us disagree about something, spontaneously I will think of arguments for why I'm right, or I will think of arguments for why you're wrong. But if I'm reasoning on my own, as I kind of mentioned earlier, the same will happen. And again, if I'm thinking about what candidate to vote for, if I have a preference to start with, I will spontaneously look for arguments that support the candidate I can, spontaneously, intuitively want to vote for. So when you're on your own, it's going to be, on the whole, a bad thing, because the confirmation bias is going to stop you from revising your views, and at worst, it's going to make you even more confident that you're right, whether you're right or wrong. By contrast, when you're talking to other people, first, because they have their own confirmation biases. So if the two of us disagree about something, you're going to find arguments for your view, I'm going to find arguments for my view, and so at least both types of arguments will be aired. And also because when people evaluate arguments, they don't have this confirmation bias. And that comes back to the point we were making just earlier, that when you listen to other people's arguments, if the arguments are good enough, you will change your mind. So you are able to evaluate the quality of arguments, even if they come from someone you don't like at all. If they make a good argument, you will see that. And so that means that if you're open-minded enough and you talk to people, the confirmation bias just becomes a good way of finding arguments, but it doesn't stop people from changing their minds, because as long as you are exposed to other people's arguments and you're open-minded enough to change your views, whoever has the best arguments is going to win, and their views will carry the day.
In polarized debates, let's say about politics or vaccines or climate or whatever, people often accuse each other of not thinking rationally. From your perspective, is the deeper issue really bad reasoning, or is it that different groups trust completely different sources and no longer see each other as credible?
You're right, it's completely the latter, I would say, in the sense that, yes, people come to trust different sources. People, unfortunately, come to mistrust, in particular, sources like scientific or medical authorities that are by and large reliable. And given that most people who are pro-vax, for instance, they don't really know why vaccines are good. I mean, they just go to the doctor tells them to vaccinate, and they vaccinate. And it's a very good heuristic that works in the vast majority of the time. And in many cases, anti-vax people are actually better informed in a way. I mean, they know more things, even if some of the things they know might be mistaken, but they're on the whole better informed. They have more information anyway than pro-vax people. And so the best that pro-vax people can do usually is say, well, I trust my doctor, or I trust the medical authorities. And if the anti-vax people don't have the same trust in the same authorities, then the argument is going to fall short very quickly.
During crises, leaders often say, just follow the science, as if evidence alone should convince people. But your work suggests it doesn't work that way. Why do messages like that so often fail?
The main obstacle is that people don't have the right information. Like, most people are just misinformed because they haven't been exposed to sufficient correct information. So, for instance, we have experiments, and other people have done similar experiments, in which you get people to talk to a chatbot. And we had done it a few years ago, so these were kind of chatbots that were entirely scripted. And now, obviously, people have done it with LLMs and with kind of generative intelligence. But talking to a chatbot who is trying to persuade you of a given view, for instance, that that conspiracy theory isn't true, or that you should vote for that person, or that vaccine, this particular vaccine is safe, they're going to be very powerful. If you spend 10 minutes talking to a chatbot, your views will change substantially. The main issue is that people don't take the time to get informed, because they don't care enough about the issues to really spend a lot of time gathering information and talking to people or trying to find the relevant experts. And one way in which we know this is that when people do pay attention, when they really look for information, we can see opinions changing very quickly. So, for instance, with some colleagues, we were looking at the evolution of French opinions towards COVID vaccines in the middle of the COVID pandemic. And in particular, in the late 2020, just before the first COVID vaccines were going to be widely released to the public, French public opinion was kind of staunchly against vaccination. So something like 80% of French people in polls said that they would probably rather not get vaccinated. But then a couple of months later, after the campaign had started, after the results of more clinical trials had been released, the opinions had completely flipped. So about 80% of people now are willing and even kind of eager to get vaccinated. And so that means that during COVID, people consumed a lot of news about, a lot of news in general and a lot of news about COVID because everybody was anxious to try to figure out what was going on. And so when there is that appetite for news, because people have to make important decisions for themselves and for people close to them, then opinion can change very quickly. Like when people are interested and when there is reliable information available, opinions are going to change very quickly, which suggests then again that in most cases, if opinion doesn't change very quickly, it's because most people don't care that much.
If reasoning depends so much on social trust, what would a more realistic way of communicating science or expertise look like? Not in terms of slogans, but in how institutions relate to the public.
So that's a great question. I think for science already does a pretty good job. Like usually, when you come out of school and you've had thousands of hours of science education, there's a bedrock of trust in science that's very strong, and most people trust basic science. If you tell people, look, science tells you that an electron is smaller than an atom, just about everybody who has received a science education will believe these sort of things. The issue is more for behaviors that you perceive as costly to you, potentially like vaccination or taking drugs that might have strong side effects. And there, like having actual people, not just broad institutions, but actual people whom you trust seems to make quite a bit of a difference. And so, for instance, in Western countries like minorities that tend to have been historically more marginalized, that have had more complicated relationships with elite institutions like science or medicine, being able to reach them oftentimes means building a long-term rapport. So you might build medical centers in disadvantaged communities with doctors and social workers that stay there for a long time, that can build relationships with the people, and that can develop the kind of personal bonds of trust that are sufficient to get people to change their minds or to adopt kind of public health behaviors when trust in broader, more abstract institutions is insufficient.
If mistrust changes how people think, not just what they believe, does rebuilding trust become a knowledge problem as well as a moral one? Are we facing a crisis of facts or a crisis of who people are willing to listen to?
That's a good question. I guess it's a bit of both. Obviously news consumption is changing with the rise of social media and this sort of things. But by and large, it's a bit less true of young people, but even then, it's easy to underestimate how important TV and mainstream media still are in the media landscape, in the sense that either a lot of people still consume them, or the news that they relay will then be taken up by influencers or by other people on social media or relayed more directly on social media. So the news environment is still, by and large, dominated by mainstream media, which is broadly a good thing, I guess, in most countries anyway. And so people are saying that they trust the media a lot less. Like if you look at polling, there seems to be a decline in trust in media. But it's not completely clear the extent to which it reflects the fact that people trust less mainstream media, or that the definition of media has broadened to encompass social media influencers, or people like that who you might be right not to trust as a category, even though some of them are really good, but there's more variance. There are changes, but there's also some stability in the kind of institutions that people trust.
My last question, Hugo. After working on these ideas for years, are you more optimistic or more pessimistic about our ability to reason together in low-trust societies, and what leads you to that view?
It's possible that my answer is more informed by my natural optimism rather than by my scholarly work. But I tend to be optimistic, and it's hard to be optimistic these days, obviously, because, it seems like everything is kind of going to shit. But I think it's still helpful to take a slightly longer historical view. And historical progress has clearly never been linear. And there has always been times in which it felt like things were going much worse than they were a few years before. But if we could take a broader view, it feels like things are progressing in most countries over time broadly, even if sometimes things are going worse temporarily. So I still think that if you take the big picture, like if you look at obviously the rise of populism and these kind of problems and economic troubles that we have now, however terrible they are, and I don't want to minimize them, obviously what happened in the late 20s and in the 30s was worse by many degrees of magnitude. And so even if the two phenomena are analogous in some ways, it still feels like the current wave is so much less bad than the one that we had about 100 years ago, that it still gives us, I think, some reason for optimism. And the fact that they got out of it eventually means that I think we can be optimistic for this time around as well.
That's a good note to end. Hugo, thank you very much for being our guest today. How is your book, The Enigma of Reason, doing?
It's doing okay. It sold quite well at the beginning because of some review in the New Yorker, and these things are extremely stochastic. So if you get one review in a big place, or if someone talks about it on TV, you're going to have a lot of sales all of a sudden. And since then, it's been stable. So it's still selling reasonably well for an academic book, and it has had a decent influence, I think, in academia. So we're quite happy about that. Yeah.
Wonderful. Hugo, thank you very much. Good luck with your further research, and thank you for being our guest.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to TrustTalk. Trust is easy to praise, much harder to understand. That's what these conversations are for. Hope to see you back for the next conversation.